was what I wanted to do was have this card obedient every time, so that if you did a reference on the card system that I created, if you, for instance, if you pushed number 13, up would appear that the person had 3 grandchildren. If you push number 4, up would appear perhaps the date of death. You push number 5 or 7, up would appear the spouse. If you pressed in item number 6, I'm transferring this thought of yours to a number system just to give an example. If you punch number 6, up would come his hobbies. But all those things sort of fit symmetrical into every card. And of course, thousands of people don't get second or third entries. They just lived and died, and the paper didn't show accomplishments, which is more often than not. And then, of course, if a person's a front page death of a high official in the community, I would condense them down to where they don't exceed my card. So the credits that they get would not be total and true, but they would be true into the things I selected to put in there. All people who run publications and newspapers are what you call editors. So they pitch out and dilute this thing down to where it fits, where they want it to fit in the paper, or in the news content. If it's a news content that they feel has great leadership, they'll put the whole thing in there. If it's just a few things that the person did, there would be a small entry into the paper. But that's just a study of the paper system.
The creation of the IBM computer occurred in the 1930s. FDR was able to back the creation of the IBM computer. The reason he backed that is for our Social Security system. In the 1940s, in the Evansville area, Credit Thrift, which was then Interstate Finance, which is now American General, was one of the first systems in Evansville to use the IBM type computer. It was in the early 1940s. Your father-in-law was instrumental in acquiring the IBM computer for American General. How did that influence you when he would show you the function of the IBM computer for the American General Corporation in Evansville?
The IBM computer system attracted my attention, and I looked at it at length, and it had a system where you punch holes into a card, and then when that card is run back through the IBM machine, the information from that card would appear. So it was a beautiful system that they created, and it's still in high motion, I'm sure, across the nation by many, many companies, and they've had many competitors to come along to create machines equally as valuable, equally as functional. And I would have liked to have had that into my study, but it was too complicated for me, I could say too expensive to get into that field of endeavor. So I did it with an old typewriter system and a card system that was readily available at all the bookstores and supply houses. So mine was of no consequence of great magnitude, so I just built my system up with a typewriter and a card system, and my main thrust was alphabetical.
But your fields of information on your 3x5 cards mimic what IBM created in the 1930s and Roy E. DeWitt brought to Credit Thrift in the 1940s. Your fields of information are no different than those hole punchings that IBM created for their card system. Why did you stay with your system once you created? Most people would have abandoned the system. And how long did it take you to get your system correct? 1, 2, 5 years, 3 years?
I would say in the overall, not even 2 years to get it around to where I thought I would function to my advantage. And so all the entries on my card have a certain place to go, like the name of the person who we speak of has to be in prime position so that it can be alphabetized correctly. All the Smiths will appear together, all the Joneses will appear together, all the Browns will appear together, but then there comes the first name and the initial. That isolates those person down to who you are searching for. Then down on that card it will show their occupation, their family, their spouse, and many, many things but it usually isolates itself down to my 3x5 chord system.
With your study of genealogy and your study of obituaries, in the infancy of your study, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, did everybody come around and shake your hand and say, "This is a great project, Charles"? And did they tell you this was a great research tool, Charles? Why did you stay with this project? Did a lot of people give you positive reinforcement?
I wouldn't give the affirmative to that. Hardly anybody really knew what I was doing. My work was not public for the first long number of years, and it was just a chord system, and I don't think it was photostated and put in accessibility for long years after that. I know I microfilmed it after I had run maybe 30 or 40 years of the work, and then when I got that microfilm, I donated it to numerous libraries in the state of Indiana so that they could do their research on the city of Evansville. But I never had any people encourage me in my days, and I think that word tenacity you're using toward me and for me is complimentary.
When an athlete gets in a zone, they can do many, many things. An athlete of basketball, football, or golfing expertise gets into what we call a zone where they can forget many other things. Would you think that some of this study you did, you got into some type of zone where you made sure you did this for an hour or two each day, made sure it was done? Can you elaborate a little bit on your zone of not being distracted to other types of things that are very easily distractible in this day and age?
In my early work on this, to keep from being distracted, I don't know what caused that, but every day in the early hours of the morning, I would pursue the paper, peruse the paper, and it'd get into that entry system of mine early in the day. And then when my day started, it would be a natural day like everybody else's. But that's how I did that at first. And it became a part and parcel of me, and so I stayed with it. And now one thing I would say, that if I went away for a 2-week vacation to the far west or the east or wherever, the task of getting back on keel, and when I got back, was often another 2 or 3 or 4 weeks to catch up with the back 2 or 3 or 4 weeks that I missed during this interchange of my time. So it did become a difficult thing if I was missing my desk for any length of time like that. If I only missed it for one holiday or one weekend, I'd catch up on Monday. But otherwise, if I was gone for any length of time, it did become a task. My staff, in the early days, my staff didn't do it. In recent years, my staff does most of my work at the typewriter or at the computer.
When I would go through our house at home or go through your place of business, your funeral home, I would go to the basement and I could find many newspapers. I could throw anything away of yours, but if I threw a newspaper away, why would that upset you so much?
You were in immediate trouble. If you threw that newspaper away, I went to the wastebasket to get it or whatever, but nobody got out of there. They could go in the Coke machine and take Coke after Coke after Coke, or they could go get something out of the fridge, but they didn't go to my stack of newspapers, even though sometimes if I was gone any length of time, that stack built up, and I wasn't too fast throwing away. I also got fireworks on that of keeping too many stacked in the corner, but that was my medium of research.
In the 1950s, your funeral home, you started your funeral home around 1954, and you started this project around 1954, and so you did all the obituary notices from the newspaper from 1954 to 2006. Can you tell us how you acquired the information from 1906 to 1954? Tell us the process that you went through at the library to microfilm all this information.
Oh yes, I didn't get my own newspaper and get started on this series of collectives until about 1955. I started the funeral in 54, but I didn't get in full swing on this until 55. And as I proceeded for the next 6, 8, 10, 15 years, I was becoming more pleased with my research factor because it did great things for me or for anybody else who wanted to look into the system. And then I thought, well, somewhere along the line I thought I'd go backwards. So in order to go backwards in this research, I didn't have my grandma keep the papers on her desk in her house, or my mother either, or my wife. And the papers had long disappeared by the time I got into gear on this, going backwards to do the research. So somewhere in the 1960s or 70s, I started to go to the library every day, or 2 or 3 times a week, and photograph, from their photograph to my photograph, the obituary page of the newspaper. Now the newspaper, or the library, kept a record of the newspaper in total photography. They took the whole reel of the whole paper, including the advertising pages, including the funny papers, including everything that was in the paper, and it's on a reel, it's on a microfilm. So I put the microfilm on the reader machine and ground it page by page, day by day, week by week, year by year, and each time I came to an obituary page, and not always were they indexed on the front of the page of paper, but if they weren't, then I had to chase the paper down to get them. And in the early days of the paper, every obituary was a single entry in the paper, so I had to comb every page. But as the years rolled, they put an index there, so I could frequently just go to the index system, get to the page, get to the page of the obits, hit the buttons, Xerox it or photograph it from the existing photograph of the paper to my Xerox or 8 by 11 that I took out of this machine. And sometimes I'd be getting 8 or 10 8 by 10 papers, just the size that Mark has right there, under each paper, because it was extensive on certain days. So I would take those several pages that I would get from each newspaper back to my office, either type them that very afternoon or type them the next morning, and then I would have another day or another few days in my collective and into my system of my 3 by 5 card. Later on, I photostat all that, but the essence of the work is the typing from the newspaper to the 3 by 5 card and then alphabetizing.
To reiterate this same subject, from 1906 to 1954, you had to go to the library on a daily basis or on a weekly basis and go through the microfilm at the library, and you had to read the whole newspaper to find the obituary columns. Were the obituary columns in perfect order like they are today, and they're in a certain section of the paper, or did you have to read the whole newspaper to find all the deaths?
Some of the early years of the newspaper, the 1906 to maybe 1916 or 2025, something like that, in that area took a little more investigating because it may not have yet arrived at this total indexing system. But in the years after that, it was indexed, so I didn't read the whole paper, except I did catch the front page as I went through, and a lot of times there were things of interest, but I didn't photostat very many of them because my pursuit was this one system, even though a lot of interesting things pass under your fingers at the same time.
If I'm an individual and my ancestor died in 1920, that's about what I would know, if they died in 1920. What's the advantage of your system as opposed to me going to the library and reading the whole all the newspapers in 1920 to find my ancestor? What's the advantage of your card system as opposed to going to the microfilm? Why is yours better?
Microphone is chronological, my system is alphabetical. That's my strong, firm answer to that idea. If George Montgomery dies, he gets into my study under George Montgomery. Now, if you don't know who you're looking for in the paper, you're just looking for 1920, that, I can't solve that. I have to have something to go for, because 1920 would have all of 1920. But if you give me a name and you're in the territory of the right year, it'll come up.
So frequent occurrences in the 1960s and 70s people would call your place of business your funeral home, and frequently be the librarian, because people would go to the librarian and say to the librarian, my